So I want to take you back in time, because this is one of the most basic philosophical questions that has been debated for 2,500 years. The original thinkers back there in ancient Greece. So we had on one side very famous figures, perhaps you've heard of someone, Epicurus, 4th century BC. This is quite remarkable for him to think about this. So we see this as the first real narrative that free will exists. What does he say? Whereas our own actions are autonomous, and it is to them that praise and blame naturally attach. So he's making the link between free will or autonomy and whether we should blame or hold praise for somebody. On the other side, you have Democritus, and Democritus was saying the first principles of the universe, and this is in ancient Greece, are atoms and empty space. Everything else is merely thought to exist. Everything else is an illusion. So we only have these atoms and empty space. This is how we. So both of them were revolutionary. Why revolutionaries? Because they rejected Greek gods. They say it's not gods that decide our fate. It is us. And because of that, we have free will. It's not the gods. Therefore, we should be blamed or praised according to that. The other one says it's none of this is up to us. The gods cannot determine all these things. It's just atoms and empty space. So both of these pushed back on Greek gods, but they were discussing whether free will exists or is everything deterministic? Is everything just determined by our atoms or by physical forces, physics? Also from this region, hopefully he has a better translation for what free will is. But about the same time, 3rd century BC, the mind is the ruler of one's body and the master of one's spirit and intelligence. It forbids oneself, orders oneself, voluntarily takes away, voluntarily chooses, moves oneself, and stops oneself. Nowadays, it seems like taken for granted. Of course, we're masters of our own self. Nothing to argue about this. But 100 years ago, this is a concept that was very difficult for people to comprehend, definitely 2,500 years ago. So very, very interesting that back then, at that time, coming from this region, he comes up with this. Nothing hinders the mind from making a choice. Even if the emperor comes here and says, you must do this, you'll have a choice. Still up to you. You're in charge. You're responsible for what it is that you do. A very interesting debate. Then from the region where I grew up, so this is a Jewish philosophy kind of thing, and this is a very confusing thing to me. I remember when we were taught this in school, I just could not understand because to me this seemed like a paradox and a conflict. All is foreseen. So all is foreseen means God can see everything. So in Jewish philosophy or Jewish religion, there is a God, there's one God instead of many gods, and the God can see everything that you're doing, not just in the past, but also knows what you're going to do in the future. So all is foreseen, but freedom is granted. If God already knows everything that I'm going to do in the future, how do I have a choice to do anything but what God saw? So there's lots of science fiction movies about this. We really have a choice. Is everything determined? We have multiple universes. What is the solution to this? But a Jewish philosopher said, actually, we can have both. Both what Epicurus and what Democritus were saying, both we can have free will. We have the ability to choose, but everything is determined by laws of physics or by God. So this is when stuff became a lot more complicated. And the general debate in philosophy is split between these 2 by 2. So you've got people who believe that determinism is true and free will exists, and these are compatibilists. So I would say that this Jewish philosopher would fall under that. Some people reject free will and reject determinism. So you've got a category for that. And then some people believe either in determinism or either in free will. Which one of those seems to appeal to you stronger? So this debate has been going on for 2,500 years, and it's still going on right now, and people are debating this endlessly. So you can see on the left side, free will is possible, and you can see some explanations for some of our great thinkers in biology, biological psychology. Here in psychology, we have this debate where Roy says, and this is one of the articles that he wrote. I was very surprised that it came out because it had such a strong statement. Do you really have free will? Of course. Here is how it evolved. And it gives a very detailed description of that. On the other side, you've got very famous folks. Some of them we also discussed. So John Barge. We've got these two here. And then, of course, behaviorism, Skinner. So you took other classes that discuss behaviorism. So everything is stimuli and response, and there's like this black box in the middle. There's no point in free will. Everything can be explained by stimuli and response. Passed away a while ago. Wegner also wrote a book about this. So we still have these debates. We have these debates in biology. We have these debates in psychology, and they date back many, many years. So this is the psychological approach. What can we do after 2,500 years? Do we have anything interesting to add to this? When we see a case study like the one from North Carolina, what can we really learn about free will? So instead of debating whether free will exists or not, a much more psychological direction that might help us to make some progress, is to ask, what do people believe? How do they come to believe whether they have free will or not? How do they come to assess this? Let's say they are a jury and they look at this case study. How do they assess it? How do they make decisions whether somebody is accountable and responsible or not? So we move beyond the debate of whether free will exists or not, and we move into studying the psychology of people and whether they think there is free will or not. So we give a lot of these kinds of experiments. In 2011, when experimental philosophy just started out, this seemed to be quite revolutionary. Because I've already shown you different kinds of scenarios and vignettes when you compare A to B, compare charity A to charity B, or somebody did A and somebody did B. But here we have something that seems very, very abstract and philosophical. Because we're asking regular people, we're asking you, to imagine a universe. And then we're giving you some rules about this universe. So let's see, for example, here. Imagine a universe, universe A, in which almost everything that has happened is completely caused by everything that happened before it. The one exception is human decision-making. We're saying everything is predetermined. Everything has laws of physics. But there's one exception to this, and this is human decision-making. Because we do not obey that, we're able to overcome that, right? So for example, one day John decided to have French fries at lunch. Since the person's decision in this universe is not completely caused by everything that happened before it, even if everything in the universe was exactly the same after until John made his decision, it did not have to happen that John would have decided to eat French fries, okay? So this is already like a very interesting universe to contemplate. And then we're showing another kind of universe. And the other universe is universe B. This is universe B. And universe B is a deterministic universe. So in this universe B, everything that happened is completely caused by everything that happened before it, including human decision-making, right? And then we have a bunch of questions asked on this. For universe A and for universe B, we try to understand how do people think about it. So the first question we want to know, which universe do you think that you live in? Is universe A or universe B closer to the universe that you think that you're in? And this allows you some kind of proxy to whether people believe that they have free will that deviates from determinism and indeterministic universe. Everybody is determined. All the animals are determined. The laws of physics are determined. But we have a soul. We have the ability to overcome. We're connected to a higher being, let's say a God. God is able to oppress us. We have something that other animals do not have. So when we ask people these kinds of things, which one would come out as more likely? So you can think about your own views on this. Which one would you select? Do we closer to universe A or universe B? I can tell you that I ran this in many different places in the world, in many different styles, and many different vignettes. We typically see, by far, people believe that they live in universe A over universe B. So we have a bunch of questions here. Yeah. So first question is realism. Which one is more real? Which one is more connected to the universe that you live in? Second is, in this kind of universe, can you hold people accountable? So for example, if everything has been determined since the beginning of the universe by laws of physics, and somebody did something wrong, is it their responsibility? It's just the universe did this, right? The physics caused it. Like they did mass murder and shot kids in the school. Why blame them? Blame the universe, right? So suddenly you start to see that people hold others accountable a lot more when the universe has some indeterministic factors into it. So in a deterministic universe, people seem to apply moral responsibility a lot less. How happy would you be in this universe? How pro-social people are, and this ties to all the other stuff that we talked about, altruism. In which one are people more altruistic? So if there's free will, does it make people more altruistic or less altruistic? So it seems like a lot of people think about, okay, so if everything is predetermined, and this guy is homeless, what can I do? The universe decided this. It's not up to me. Nothing can be done about it. It's all been predetermined. Therefore, not my responsibility. Nothing can be done about it. The people who believe in free will sometimes say, you know, maybe the person has a choice. It could go for good. If this person has a choice, maybe I can work with this person, you know, to help them make the right choice. Sometimes it's like, if they're here homeless on the side of the street, then they've chosen to do this. Therefore, they should not be helped, right? But free will can come in all sorts of different varieties, but it does make people a lot more judgmental or trying to assess whether other people are in their position because they've chosen this or because they have free will. Yeah, so we typically contrast these kinds of things and we give this in a between subject design, and then we ask people these kinds of questions. You can see here the science paper. Nowadays, it seems like a very simple thing. It's like, why would these kind of vignettes make it to a science paper in a journal of science? So it seems like they were just presenting to the world the experimental philosophy and the problem of free will. So sometimes all you need are two very simple vignettes, like the one I just showed you, in order to make it to the journal of science, right? But what's nice about it is that these two philosophers said, we're going to try, instead of, sitting in our philosophy department and not thinking, oh, maybe free will is that, maybe free will is, what we're going to do is we're going to adopt social psychology, and we're going to run real experiments where we present different vignettes about imaginary universes, and we're going to ask people how they respond to them, whether they think this is real, whether it has more accountability, and then for them to act as juries. If North Carolina case study happened in this universe or happened in that universe, would you hold a person accountable? Would you not? So this is a new paradigm. Up until 2011, philosophers couldn't care less about empirical studies. Suddenly, experimental philosophy said, okay, we're going to work together with social psychology in order to study these things in more depth. And this started this whole movement about the X-Files, working together in order to understand philosophy using social psychology methods. Okay? So I've used these universes many, many times in different variations. Here's from one paper. I think we have like about 10 of these different paradigms, looking at it from different perspectives. So our little contribution to this whole thing for these two descriptions, the indeterministic and the deterministic universes, is that we weren't sure where the people are answering the way that they're answering is because they really feel that this is the right universe, that indeterministic universe, the universe with free will, is really the most realistic one. Or maybe they're just not sure. So we added just a control condition. You can see here you have three conditions: deterministic universe, indeterministic universe, and an uncertain universe. So we thought maybe people are just uncertain whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic. So we added a control condition. And honestly, coming into it, I really thought that people would just be very uncertain. But it seems like our results, for example, from this study, you can see the realism column is the left one. You can see that by far, people are very certain that we live in an indeterministic universe, which is already very interesting. So we asked how realistic is the deterministic universe, and it goes a lot lower than that. And uncertainty is somewhere in between. So it's not that people are uncertain about which universe this is. It is more that they think that the indeterministic universe where human decision making is not obeying the laws of physics is the right kind of universe. Now, the question is, why would people want to believe this kind of thing? How is this related to North Carolina Supreme Court case? So here you can already see we didn't just measure realism, we also measured happiness, learning, meaningfulness, uniqueness, prosociality, future, responsibility. And although I kind of stopped the Mentimeter in between, so only 3 people answered the first one, 5 people answered the first one. So you can see over here we have realism 73. We have morally responsible 86. How happy would you be? 69. How pro-social are 55. But if we look at the other one, you can see there's a lot lower. So how realistic is this? 51. How morally responsible are you? Lower, lower, lower. So it just seems like, even in this very small sample, generally the way that people think about it, even in a within subject design, where you saw both conditions, it seems like we attribute this less. And so if we want to have prosociality and we want to have some responsibility and accountability, then we need some kind of a level of free will. People just have these associations. So one of the reasons that we might believe that we live in an indeterministic universe is that so that we can be happier, so that we can hold people accountable, so that we can encourage people to be more pro-social. So when I showed you Roy Baumeister thinks that we evolved to have free will, and free will definitely does exist because we have the inherent capacity to overcome our urges, needs, desires, the willpower in order to go beyond ourselves so that we can coexist with others in society. A much more cynical view is the philosopher Nietzsche. So men are considered to be free so that they might be judged and punished. So he's a determinist person. He believes that the only reason why we have the concept of free will is that so we can hold people accountable. So, for example, capitalist societies, up until a century or two ago, everybody was peasants, farmers that harvest the field. No responsibility. We follow either the king or we follow the pope, the religion, right? There was either the religion or the big figure in a monarchy or an empire. But in order to get everybody to contribute to the economy, in order to get people to assume responsibility for their own lives, capitalism said, it's all up to you. If you assume responsibility, if you pursue your future, if you pursue education, if you pursue a business, if you pursue, then you'll be able to live the American dream, the world dream, the capitalist dream of you will have more money, right? So capitalism is all about empowering the free will concept in people so that they'll be more proactive. So from a cynical view to a capitalist view about Protestant ethics. So we have this big debate between Roy Baumeister and recently passed away, I think last year, Dennett. So Dennett was arguing free will is only worth having if it enables the individual to get what she or he wants. So for example, if I want money or fame or reputation, therefore I need free will. What is it good for if I can't exercise free will to get something? But Roy Baumeister was also a little bit confusing for me. He said free will is actually for following rules. How is this for following rules? There's a contradiction. Free will, how is it for, if I follow the police officer to a detention center, am I exercising my free will or not? Seems a little bit confusing. But Roy Baumeister is arguing that all of us are animals deep within. We do whatever we want, follow our urges, needs, desires. We don't take into consideration anybody else. So for us to coexist with others in society, for us to say, okay, police officers get our respect. We go and sit in jail because we did something wrong. This is us giving our own self, overcoming with willpower our urges and desires in order to coexist with others in society. So very interesting controversy between these two. I'll just play a little bit of a clip because I feel like it might be good for you to get to know some of the biggest figures in social psychology, just to get a feel of how they discuss things like free will.
Free will assumes personal agency. Free will and moral responsibility are intertwined in a kind of descriptive circularity. How to escape the circle? One way is to see that free will and moral responsibility do not exist in isolation. Interpersonal, social, and cultural factors play crucial roles. That's why I go back to Florida State University to meet social psychologist Roy Baumeister.
Well, in very plain terms, the idea of free will is that the person could act differently. A moral judgment is essentially a judgment about should that person have acted differently. The same with a legal judgment. It's should the person have done something else rather than rob the liquor store. Mm-hmm. So the judgment that the person should act differently is based on the assumption that the person could act differently. Mm-hmm. So to my way of thinking, at least in this very simple sense of free will, that is essential to moral responsibility. Now, the argument goes the other way too. Why did we evolve free will? Why we develop that capacity? The ability to act morally is one of the crucial things that makes us human, that enables us to function well. One of the most basic norms is reciprocity. All other cultures do, if you do something to me, I should do it back to you. That's a kind of moral idea. But to control our behavior by it and actually pay someone back for something they've done for us, that requires a sense of moral responsibility, requires that higher mentality. It makes culture work, but it makes it possible.
Yeah. So what I like about this and why it's important for me that you see this is just to show you that of all the types of psychology that are out there, social psychology is the only domain that really goes deep into the philosophy of not just morality, what is moral and what is not, but what enables us to be moral, what enables us to coexist with others in society, what enables us to be held accountable for anything. So in order to be a good social psychologist, sometimes you need to really venture into the realms of philosophy. So this is a social psychologist. On the other side, you have Daniel Dennett, who is one of the biggest philosophers of our century, talking very briefly about what is it that he considers free will to be.
I recall how philosopher Daniel Dennett put it to me.
People want to know about free will. They want to protect free will, and so they should. It's very important. If the world is undetermined, it's just as hard to see how you could have free will that mattered because you want to determine what you do. It's really interesting that we use this word determined, and mainly it's a term of praise. We say, she's so determined, and so we should. We want to determine our actions, but we don't want us to be determined in the determining of our actions.
Yeah, so it keeps on going. It's a very good episode. They did, I think, about 10 different chapters where they interviewed the different philosophers and social psychologists, many of them who I met down there in this conference. And this debate of free will really opened up a bunch of other things. So in 2011, it started from free will. Does free will exist or not? I was very much into it, and I did a bunch of work on this. But there's more happening than just free will. So I'm going to show you, for example, one of the classic effects called the side effect effect.
Josh, I love philosophy. I love to try to understand what it's all about. You tell me something new called experimental philosophy. That sounds like a contradiction.
How do you have experimental philosophy?
Well, experimental philosophy is actually kind of continuing in a really long tradition of philosophy. So the way philosophers often think about certain questions is by constructing thought experiments. So if Plato is interested in trying to understand, say, what courage is, he'll construct a certain story and then ask the reader, so would you say that that is courage? What experimental philosophers do is they take those thought experiments but actually bring them to the people and ask people in systematic experimental studies what they think about these thought experiments. Is this thing actually courage? Is it not? And so forth.
Okay, what's an example?
Well, one of the earliest studies that I did was about the question what it is to do something intentionally. So if you're wondering, what it is to do something on purpose versus not on purpose, one way you can figure this out is just by going through some cases and seeing would we say this is on purpose and would we say that's not on purpose. So I just did a simple study to begin with that was just conducted actually on people just hanging out in a park. And they were randomly assigned to get one of two versions. So here's a first version of the story. Imagine the vice president of a company goes to the chairman of the board and he says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, but it's also going to harm the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know this is going to harm the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So let's implement the policy. They implement the policy, and sure enough, it harms the environment.
And it makes money.
And it makes money.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the question. Did he harm the environment intentionally? So what do you think?
Yeah, so just to make this a little bit clearer, this is the two versions. So actually, this is called the Knob effect, because Joshua Knob is the one who introduced this effect. And it is about this chairman. Vice president of the company went to the chairman of the board and said, we are thinking of starting a new program. It will help us increase profit, but it will also harm or help the environment. And then the chairman says, I don't really care about any of that. I just want to make money. And then, sure enough, the environment was either harmed or helped. How do people assess intent? Did the chairman intend to do this for the environment or not? And you would think people would answer very similarly in these two scenarios. But what Joshua Knob actually found is that there was some misalignment over there. And this is what he presents in this video.
I might say no, but other people I would think because it has a negative effect, there might be an emotion to say yes.
Yes, sure enough. If you try this, more than 80% of people say, yeah, he harmed the environment intentionally. And if you ask them why they say that, they say, well, it's just because he knew he was going to harm the environment, and then he just went ahead and did it anyway.
Yeah, there's certain logic to that.
But then we thought maybe there's something going on here further, something that goes beyond just the fact that he knew it. And then we were thinking in particular, maybe it's the fact that people think that harming the environment is bad. So we decided to construct another case that was exactly the same, except we just changed the word harm to help. So the vice president goes to the chairman of the board, and he says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, and it's also going to help the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know it's going to help the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So they implement the policy, and sure enough, it helps the environment. Did he help the environment intentionally? Yeah, overwhelmingly people say no.
No, right.
But it seems so strange because if you think about what it is to do something intentionally, you think it has nothing to do with whether it's good or bad.
And the words you used were exactly the same, except one was harm and one was help. Every word was the same. His attitude, his personality.
Yeah. So they do a lot of these kinds of studies, and this kind of ties experimental philosophy suddenly to social psychology and judgment decision-making, but just the outcome changes the way that people attribute something like intent, something like free will, something like accountability. So an outcome bias in philosophy, in the way that people think about these things. So you can see I replicated this many, many times also in the classroom. So when I gave fundamentals of social psychology, you can see I presented this with the two vignettes. And then people definitely attribute a lot more intent and blame for the harmed environment compared to the health environment. And then we recently published, I think it was this last year, kind of a combination of those. So I really like what Joshua Knob did. So he did this in 2007. And then I really like the free will manipulation, which I did many, many times. So together with two others, we said, how about we combine these two things? So we manipulate both whether it was harmed or helped, and also whether it was controlled, deterministic, or indeterministic universe. We want to see, are they complementary? Do they work independently? Is there maybe an interaction between them? And we find some very interesting things. So we find both support, of course, for the free will and deterministic universe manipulation. We find support for the Knob effect. We also find support for some kind of interactions and some interesting insights over them. Just goes to show you how you can play with these if you want to in your research. Is there anything else that goes beyond things like the Knob effect, side effect, or the free will indeterministic universe? There's a lot. So one of the interesting things is that you can take science fiction movies, let's say The Matrix, if you're familiar with The Matrix. For me, The Matrix was one of the biggest movies ever. I just remember sitting there in the cinema when this thing came out, just not believing what is in front of me. You think about, do you take the red pill or the blue pill? Do you want to stay in a simulation, or do you want to wake up and and be part of the existence of fighting these robots. Once you've woken up, do you want to stay woken up, or do you want to be hooked up back to the machine? So Matrix really captures that in an unbelievable story. But you can actually run experiments on this. And this is one of the classic experiments in experimental philosophy presented by Josh Knobe.
Hi, I'm Joshua Knobe from Yale University, and today I'm going to be talking about a new approach to philosophy that is sometimes called experimental philosophy. The basic idea behind experimental philosophy is that we might be able to make some philosophical progress by actually going out and running systematic experimental studies, much like the experiments people usually run in social psychology or in cognitive science. Now you might be thinking, how could running a study like that ever help us make any progress in philosophy? After all, philosophy isn't supposed to be about how people ordinarily think. It is supposed to be about figuring out which answers to these questions are actually the right ones. This is definitely exactly the right question to be asking, but experimental philosophers claim that by running these studies, we can get some valuable insight into why people have the thoughts they do. And if we understand why people typically have the thoughts they do, we might be able to get a better sense of whether we should be putting our trust in those thoughts or just dismissing them. There's a lot of controversy about whether this approach can ever actually work, but I thought it might be good just to give you a quick example so that you can make up your mind for yourself. The experimental philosopher Philippe de Brigard recently ran a series of experiments to investigate the way people ordinarily think about a famous philosophical thought experiment called the experience machine. His idea was that if we could get a better understanding of what is going on in our minds when we hear this thought experiment, we might be in a better position to figure out whether our thoughts about it are correct or incorrect. Now, the experience machine thought experiment goes like this. Imagine that in the future, there are super duper neuroscientists, and these neuroscientists are able to create a machine that can stimulate your brain in such a way that you think you're having a truly amazing life. So if you enter the machine, you will think you are accomplishing extraordinary things, that you're having deep and fulfilling relationships, and that everyone admires and respects you. But you won't really be doing anything at all. In real life, you'll just be a person lying in a vat of water somewhere, being stimulated to believe that all these amazing things are happening. Now comes the question, would you go into the machine? Most people say that they wouldn't, and philosophers sometimes start with this basic thought and use it as part of an argument for the conclusion that there's more to life than just experiencing happiness, that there's something important about being connected up in the right way to reality. But de Brigard thought that maybe there was more to the story, so he conducted an experiment in which participants were given a case we might call the reverse experience machine. The reverse experience machine case goes like this. Imagine you are going about your ordinary life when one day you get a visit from a mysterious man named Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith explains to you that this whole life you think you've been leading, with all your supposed friends, your accomplishments, even your mother and father, is simply an illusion. A number of years ago, you encountered some super duper neuroscientists, and they offered to put you into an experience machine where you would be stimulated to believe that you had exactly this life you think you've been having. Now you face a question. If you'd like, you can leave the machine and go back to your real life. Or, if you'd prefer, you can stay inside the machine, and the neuroscientists will erase any memory you have of the visit from Smith. So think about it for a moment. What would you do? When de Brigard framed the thought experiment in this reversed way, he found that most people actually said they wanted to stay in the machine. So now it seems that we have learned something important about ourselves, and that we might want to reevaluate the conclusion we drew from the original version. When we were just thinking about that original version, we had a particular intuition, and that intuition led us, as part of a complex philosophical argument, to arrive at a certain conclusion about what was truly important in life. But now it seems that we've acquired some new knowledge about the psychological processes that made us have that intuition in the first place. We learned that these processes aren't just sensitive to the difference between reality and illusion. They also leave us with a strong tendency to stick with whatever sort of life we've already got. So, now that you've learned this new fact about how people think, would you still arrive at the same conclusion from the experience machine thought experiment?
Yeah, would you enter the experience machine or not? Like somebody comes to you and says to you that you lived your whole life in this simulation. And it might have seemed, especially when he did this video 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when they ran this experiment, it seemed like it's impossible. But as we're getting very close to VR, really getting to feel real, and we have things that are senses, we can move around in the same spot, we can be submerged totally in a VR, it gets very close to this kind of experience machine. So if we will have, let's say in a decade or two, definitely in your lifetime, you're going to get to a VR that is so good that you can spend your entire life just sitting there in VR. Would you want to be hooked up and just live in that reality? Or if you're already hooked up in this, how do you know that this is reality? If somebody comes to you and says, do you want to wake up? Would you want to wake up? Right? So what I like about this, there's so many things that I like about this, but first of all, experimental philosophy is a new movement. So you can actually take one of your philosophy questions, the one that you enjoy the most, and you can start to play with this. So what Philippe did over here, for example, he took a famous philosophical question, and then he ran a first experiment, and then he got one result, and then he thought he arrived at some kind of a conclusion that is aligned perhaps with what philosophers were saying, authenticity matter. But then you can run a replication of this, and you can add an extension on this. It changes something, changes the parameters. And this can come from all sorts of different places. For example, you watch The Matrix. You feel, oh my gosh, in The Matrix, I saw people that are already out of their machine or already inside the machine, whether they want to change, they want to go back into the machine, they want to get out of the machine. You can play with the different scenarios and try to manipulate this in an experiment using experimental philosophy. And then to gain some real insights about people just want to stay with the life that they know and stay in the reality that they understand, the reality that they perceive to be real. So a lot of interesting directions here. I really like this because most of these vignettes, when I see undergraduates doing internships or they're doing their thesis, they're going into these very, very complicated things. They run on 10 different scales. They do moderation, mediation, multi-level. Sometimes all you need are very, very simple vignettes about people meet somebody who offers them to go into an experience machine. Okay? So lots of interesting things if you want to read a little bit more about this. Now we have journals called Philosophical Psychology. So there's really a lot more going on in experimental philosophy. It's really interesting to try and see, the experience is negative, the experience is positive. So you can play with the outcome. You can experience a machine that is helpful for you and gives you amazing things, and you can have a machine that does horrible things for you, and you would like to escape. So how do people think about whether they want to go back or remain? So you can see that even in the negative, it's very, very clear, but in the other ones, it's a little bit more balanced than that. Because we care about the credibility of these things, we want to ask. So finally, I show you some results, and I'm not saying this is bad, don't listen to this, but I do want you to tie this back to what we discussed in last week. Do we know that this is replicable or not? Do we know that this is credible or not? So for me, for example, from my own experience, I wanted to know whether this is replicable and whether this is credible. So I conducted many of these studies myself. But actually, one of the important things that we can do is that we can go and seek out replication. So even though this is a very young group, and they've only existed since 2011, there's already a very large movement for replication. Actually, one of the things that I really appreciate about them is that even though they're young, and even though the methods are very, very simple, they already ran a very large mass replication of many of the experiments in experimental philosophy. So they got all the experimental philosophers, and they said the most important questions that we've answered in the last 10 years since experimental philosophy started are these. Let's all run these together in different labs from around the world and see whether this replicates or not. So you can see it's a very large collaboration. I know a lot of people here. They did an amazing job over, and everything is open science, and everything is pre-registered. So very, very nice. And then you can see kind of like the outcome of this whole thing. And many of the problems in experimental philosophy replicate very well. Actually, of all the domains that try to establish whether they're replicable or not, experimental philosophy, maybe because it's new, maybe because it's so simple, you have about 70–80% replicability, which is very, very high compared to everything else. So they've done a bunch of analyses. I don't know if you remember the P-curve. So for example, they run a P-curve on this, and it follows the needed pattern. So they really, really care. This group of social psychologists and experimental philosophers really, really care about credibility. Right? So even when we want to look at mass replications, independent replications, many labs from around the world, pre-registered, open science, then we have this in experimental philosophy. This is another reason why I wanted to end this course on that note, because a lot of these things here I've seen myself, and I've read a lot of replications to show that this is credible. Okay? I'll give you another example for some of these things, the essential moral self. We have time for this? We don't, so I'm just going to explain this to you. So the essential moral self, Nina Struminger and Charles Nichols did an amazing experiment, and they wanted to see what is the most important thing to people. What do people care most about, or what is tied to the one true self that they hold about themselves? So they had this experiment, and this is a classic experimental philosophy kind of manipulation. And they said, imagine that you went through brain surgery. Something happened, brain surgery, and then afterwards, you're exactly the same person aside from one factor. So for example, the one factor is that you change your morality. The one factor is that you change your religion. The one factor is that you you became more apathic, or you have amnesia. You don't remember different things. How much of that person is you? How much is that your true self? And it seems like when we take away morality, when people have different morality, then people say this is no longer the same person. If people who experience amnesia, then a little bit less than that. Apathy, a little bit less than that. Agnosia, a little bit less than that. It seems like the most essential thing, their conclusion is, using this experiment, is that we associate morality to be the core essence of a person. If we have brain surgery and people change their morality, then we say it's not the same person anymore. So I love this article. It's very influential. It helped us understand a lot of things in moral philosophy. And then I ran this in the class, and we replicated this many times. And then after one class that I presented this, a student came to me at HPU and said, this is terrific. I really want to test this out. But I don't think it's actually going to be morality. I think it's actually going to be something different. Instead, I think for a lot of people, their religion or their ideology, perhaps political ideology, is going to beat morality. And so this is great. Let's run this exactly the same way that they did, doing all the original conditions, but let's also add what happens if the person wakes up from a brain surgery and they have a different religion, and suddenly they have a different ideology. Is this going to matter more than morality? So the nice thing about this is that we were able to very successfully replicate the original, and we added extensions, and the extensions are meaningful. So you can see the religion here, kind of like towards the left, and ideology gets close to morality, but morality is still the winner. So even though we came out with new factors, and the replication extension was testing more factors than the original, the conclusion from the original study about morality beating everybody else still remains and holds up. So this is great. This is an amazing undergraduate thesis project. There's more about the true self, but I'm going to skip this because we're about to leave. But I just want to say that we conducted a lot of these, and we did this with register reports. So there's lots of interesting studies here where we were able to replicate these studies again and again. So almost everything that I did with experimental philosophy, we were able to replicate and also add some interesting extensions. Finally, I want to tie all this semester together to go back to the things that we started from. So if you remember, the first session we had was Peter Singer talking about the girl in the pond, drowning in the pond. Are we going to save this person or not? Morality, what can we do about this? And Peter Singer says, it's up to us. We can create charities. We can help the world do more effective altruism. And many of his students, including Will McCaskill, have built amazing charities that have really changed the world. So Will McCaskill was a philosophy major at, I think, Oxford. And he decided after listening to Peter Singer that he's going to build a charity. And he's one of the major organizers. There's many books that came out, very, very influential. I recommend that you follow him. Very reflective about both the good and the bad in effective altruism, and always aiming to apply scientific principles and improve. What I like about this is that he also, it's very difficult for academics to communicate well, but he goes on the Daily Show, very interesting show if you follow that. A little bit of humor, a little bit of news and what's happening in the world. And he goes and he explains the role of philosophy, the role of social psychology, the role of using scientific principles in order to do more good and do good better. So I'll leave you with this. Will McCaskill talks to The Daily Show about how can we use experimental philosophy and social psychology in practice. We don't have time for all of this. It's an amazing interview, and I really like how he communicates through all of this. I feel like this ties everything that we've done in this semester together. So we had these two different projects. On one side, we care about credibility and what's happening in science, and what is it about banality of evil, and social psychology, what is true, what is not true, what is credible, what is not credible. And on the other side, we have all these factors about charity and altruism. And we understand the psychological factors behind how people think about charity and how people help one another, and using principles like experimental philosophy in order to understand these kind of things. So when we want to communicate this to other people, we just use a very simple thought experiment just to help them understand. The girl drowning in a pond, do you save the girl or not? Present the people with very simple vignettes in order to go from a very simple case study to something that is life-changing, something where you can feel like, I need to step up and change the world. I need to do something for the better.